Donc, bonjour à tout le monde. Je suis Maurice Rosenberg, le président de la Fondation Pierre Elliott Trudeau et l'ancien sous-ministre des Affaires étrangères. Et c'est un plaisir pour moi d'être modérateur de cette première panel qui va traiter des défis de la politique étrangère globale dans le contexte de partenariat stratégique entre le Canada et l'Union européenne. There has been a lot of attention paid to one of the negotiations that Canada and the EU have been involved in, and that's the trade agreement, and probably it's fair to say a lot less attention has been paid to the strategic partnership agreement, so we have a good opportunity today to learn a little bit more about that and how it may be operationalized. SPA, as has already been said, deepens Canada-EU cooperation in important areas of foreign and security policy and complements the economic and trade relationship, which is the subject of the CETA. And just to establish boundaries between this panel and the next panel will deal with the environment, climate change, and energy, so it wasn't my intention to focus on that primarily, although everything is connected to everything else, so there may well be a few words that are said about some of these questions, but rather to talk about a range of subjects, including the promotion of human rights and democracy, pluralism and diversity, fragile states, conflict prevention, multilateral cooperation, etc. To do that, we have four panelists. You have their biographies in the conference material, so I'm not going to go through those extensively, but we have on my left Edita Hrda, who you just heard, who's the Managing Director for the Americas for the European External Action Service. Next to her is Dr. David Carment, who's a Professor of International Affairs at Carleton University at the Norman Paterson School. Next to him is Vincent Rigby, who is the Assistant Deputy Minister of Strategic Policy at the Department of Global Affairs. And then last but not least, Colin Robertson, who's the Vice President and a Senior Research Fellow at the Canadian Global Affairs Institute. So I thought I would perhaps just start with Edita briefly, just picking up from your talk. As I said, the idea of the SPA is a European idea. I think Canada is the first developed country with whom the European Union has negotiated such an agreement. I wonder if you could tell us a little bit about the idea behind the SPA and how you would actually see, with this quite ambitious agenda, how one would go about operationalizing this, how you would see working with Canada to actually give real effect to the issues that are addressed in the SPA.
Thank you for asking me this question. I think we have the chief negotiator from the Canadian side here, and I was not the chief negotiator from the EU side, so if I may have my opinion on it. So I think it's sometimes very important to sit down and to make a reflection of that, what the countries are doing really together. Because there are so many connections between our people, and sometimes the institutions, they have no idea what is really happening in the world, even being globalized and so. So it was, I think, very important for European Union and Canada to decide to start the negotiations, because we made a very important review on that, what is already done. And as I said, it's very important to see strategically where we have more ideas to do something together. And during such negotiations, there are many discussions around, and there are people coming with bright ideas which are worth to develop. And that's what happened. This agreement is really bright. It goes from human rights through schooling system, education, investigation, and really the scope is climate change. The scope is very bright. And I think what will be important after the signature, really to sit together and have a strategic thinking about it, what will be the future of the relation for the next 40 years.
In both the case of the SPA and the CETA I think it was well known that the degree of involvement of provincial governments in Canada was perhaps unprecedented in terms of the negotiation of a trade agreement. And of course, in the EU context, the kind of EU federalism necessarily requires involvement of the member states. When I look at the SPA, a lot of it is obviously within the competence of the Commission, of the European Union and of Canada, but there are areas that involve, in Canada, subnational governments, and in Europe, the national governments. Are there mechanisms for engaging them in the discussions that will take place?
Of course, definitely. It must be decided how much it will be a mixed agreement, means European Union and the member states. And of course, in the part where it is really only competence of the member states, they will be very much involved, and that's a good space for also bilateral cooperation between Canada and the member states.
Thank you. Maybe I can turn to Vince. Since I think the SPA was initialed, it hasn't been formally signed yet, we've had a significant event in Canada, a change in government, and a change as a result, a quite significant change in some of the foreign policy priorities and development priorities of the new government, which seem to mirror a lot of the areas of interest in the SPA, the ones that I mentioned earlier: more commitment to engagement in multilateralism, commitments, this isn't entirely new, on democracy promotion, on human rights, on women's rights, on pluralism, et cetera. Can you talk a little bit about, from the view of the Canadian government, and you are the Assistant Deputy Minister for Strategic Policy in the department, how you see the confluence between your strategic priorities and the SPA, and what opportunities you might see to advance the Canadian government's agenda?
Absolutely. Thanks very much, Morris. It's quite striking, actually, how much confluence there is. I think if you look across any of the new priorities or objectives of the new government, I think you can map them, you can link them very, very carefully, very, very easily to the SPA at the end of the day. So you've already noted a number of areas where Canada is putting increased focus. And I would say that maybe it shouldn't be a complete surprise that there is such confluence, given that I think with this new government, there have been changes, but there's also a remarkable degree of continuity as well. And this has been mentioned by Minister Dion and other ministers and the Prime Minister himself, that sort of the fundamental pillars of Canadian international policy in terms of security, prosperity, values, et cetera, are still there. You've already mentioned in terms of multilateralism, this is clearly a government that wants to show constructive engagement, leadership on the international stage, and in particular through multilateral channels. So we've already seen that through the announcement of the Security Council candidature in 21-22, but you've also seen in terms of what Canada is doing on climate change, what Canada is starting to do in terms of, as you mentioned, peaceful pluralism, inclusive governance, democracy, human rights, et cetera. I think right across the spectrum here in terms of some of the specific issues that Canada wants to play a leadership role on in multilateral channels, there's a very natural affinity with the SPA. There's a lot that you can, as I said before, map specific articles, specific chapters in the SPA that really give us a chance to build and to really go even further from that foundation. I think, as with any Canadian government, I think with any government, prosperity is always going to be a major international policy objective. I think for this government, as with any other Canadian government, trade investment is absolutely critical. So again, we've got a very, very robust trade agenda and an investment agenda, implementing FTAs, new FTAs, looking to emerging markets. So again, we've already mentioned CETA, strong articles in the SPA with respect to trade and investment and prosperity. So I think there's a very natural affinity there as well. In terms of security, this is, again, it's already been mentioned by some of the previous speakers. We've done a lot of work in the security realm already between Canada and the EU in the past. This is a government that's going to continue to place a great deal of emphasis on security issues. We've got a defense policy review that's just about to, or is underway now, But it's not just about the role of our armed forces. It's about greater engagement in peace support operations through the UN and other multilateral channels. It's about more conflict prevention, more peace-building activities. The Minister Dion, has mentioned the fact that he'd like Canada to be a determined peace builder. And so I think if you look at some of the language in the SPA and the work that we've done with the EU in the past, there's a natural link there. The final piece I'd mention is development. And so this is a government that I think is committed to the 2030 agenda, the Sustainable Development Goals. We'll be launching an international assistance review in the coming days that's going to look at how Canada can refocus its international assistance and its development assistance on the poorest and the most vulnerable, and also on fragile states. And again, if you look at the SPA, there's a firm commitment to poverty eradication. There's a lot of good language on fragile states and what our development assistance, international assistance can do there, as well as our security programs. I think that this is a government that may surprise a few people when it comes to development. I think that there's going to be a very, very strong development agenda as we move forward. So lots of opportunities there to work with the EU. We've already doing some bilateral work, project work, and I think there's the only place to go is up, quite frankly, on that side.
Thanks. So lots of areas to kind of hone in on a little bit. So let me just pick one to start, and that is the issue of conflict prevention and fragile states. And of course, Article 7 of the SPA commits the parties to strengthen their joint efforts in support of crisis management and capacity building and further enhance their cooperation in this regard, including on EU operations and missions. So, I mean, the whole issue of fragile states, there was an article in Foreign Affairs a couple of years ago called The Rise and Fall of the Failed State Paradigm, and it argued that looking at the list of failed states in the world, most of them, with a very few exceptions, actually did not pose a threat or an immediate threat to global peace and security. That was, an interesting, somewhat controversial article. I wanted to ask Professor Carment, maybe to comment on that, to ask you how you see the challenge of supporting fragile states, and what would you advise it would take to make the cooperation between Canada and the EU effective? How would you operationalize that cooperation, and where would you do it? There are areas in the world where presumably there's more of a comparative advantage for Canada and the EU to work together. So I'd like to hear you on that.
Well, thank you very much. Let me begin by just commenting that I was spending my last year on my sabbatical in Germany. And if there was one word that captured the essence of my experience there, it is resilience. And resilience captures, I think, also the impetus behind conflict prevention and strengthening failed and fragile states. Why do I refer to my experience in Germany as being one of resilience? Because this is a place that has experienced significant conflict, as we know, but also the region in which I was doing my sabbatical happened to be the former the heart of the coal and steel industry, and it had basically reinvented itself as the engine of growth for the European Union in many respects. So if resilience can be achieved internally through the European Union, then I see no reason why it can't be, in essence, brought to other countries that are experiencing similar calamities. There are important lessons the EU can provide for these countries that are sufficiently incapable of pulling themselves out of poverty, out of conflict, out of their economic political malaise. Canada, too, has experienced internal turmoil, as we know, and has lessons for the world. As much as it may dismay some people to think that we should begin exporting some of our values, I think that's precisely what we should be doing. There isn't enough focus on governance and strengthening institutions in these weaker states of the world. To give you some sense of the tasks ahead, there are approximately 10 countries that have been stuck in a fragility trap for the better part of 20 years. What does that mean? That is that they have been at the bottom rung of the economic, political, conflict order or rank for the better part of 20 years. And they show no indication of pulling themselves out of that situation. It's true that poverty decreases in poverty are improving over time. Poverty reduction has been successful. but the equitable, sustainable development aspect of strengthening these states has been underachieved. And so where Canada and I think the European Union need to focus their attention is precisely on those countries that are currently not demonstrating sufficient resolve or resilience to progress further into the economic development that we would expect of countries that are engaged fully in the global economy. Afghanistan is on that list, but so are a host of other African countries. In fact, the bulk of the countries that are on so-called in the fragility trap are from sub-Saharan Africa. For obvious reasons, and that's perhaps where Canada and the EU should focus their energies. But there are also other zones that overlap between Canada and the EU. Obviously, Ukraine not being a fragile state in the same sense that the CAR, the Central African Republic, or South Sudan are, but nevertheless is one that is experiencing sufficient internal turmoil that it needs guidance and direction from outside. And I think this is where Canada and the EU can focus their energies. More specifically, we've heard reference to democracy promotion, but what exactly does that mean to a country that has no prior history of democratic practice? One needs to think more specifically about rule of law and delivering justice. And this is where a country like Canada and the European Union can both deliver. We have experience in both exporting, if you will, good practices when it comes to proper judicial systems, as well as training those in the police force or administering the rule of law. I would also suggest then that it is more than simply economic development that will pull these countries out of their state of fragility. We need to think holistically, and in that sense, the European Union has been a leader in this area, has been a leader in delivering conflict prevention. Canada was at one time investing heavily in these areas as well. We've fallen behind, but the tools are all there at our disposal. We've invested heavily in the analytical side of conflict prevention. The External Action Service is a leader in the early warnings side of conflict prevention, and the EU itself is a conflict prevention mechanism. Canada can, I think, now begin to learn from the EU and reinvest in those tools that they've previously developed and now need to apply across the board. So I would just conclude by saying, in general, there are key areas where Canada and EU interests overlap. There are key areas where we can focus, and we have to look beyond economic development and think more specifically about how to make these countries that are considered failed or in some cases fragile more resilient.
Thanks. Just to follow up on that a little bit for you or for anybody on the paneling, one of the challenges in looking at some of the most fragile states in the world is that the work of sort of building security and stability as a baseline for other things is not something that will take place over the course of an election mandate. That the political timetable does not coincide with the timetable that's actually needed to effectively bring a sustained approach and the kind of strategic patience that's needed, that's sometimes in the multi-decades, if you're looking at some of the most damaged countries in the world. And I'm just wondering whether, because this has been a frustration, and you've seen a kind of a yo-yoing of aid that would go up one year and down the next. Does the SPA, the fact that you've got two countries coming together to make commitments and set priorities in these areas, create any kind of discipline and make it more difficult for changes of government to kind of change their minds and say, well, we've got another priority, we're no longer funding this? In other words, is there some institutional benefit to a mechanism like the SPA that may actually help achieve practical results over the long term on this kind of development assistance?
Well, I would say, first of all, let's draw lessons from what has been working quite well. We've already heard that the current government is committed to maternal health. And so this is a commitment that's long-standing. It's been in place for 10 years, if not more. And there's no reason to believe that it won't be in place for another 10 years. The other long-term commitment that goes well beyond the mandate of any particular leader will be obviously climate change. And we heard from Angela Merkel, a leader in the field of climate change policy, that it's going to take a minimum of 50 years before we achieve any reasonable results. It's that kind of political resolve that's quite frankly required to see any of these initiatives forward. Conflict prevention is a little bit trickier, of course, because one doesn't see the results of your actions immediately. Conflict prevention is a long-term investment, one that can take up to 50 or more years to realize. Democracies, as they say, are not made overnight. So the mechanism here has to be a long-term strategic one, and that's precisely what you're suggesting, that we need a memorandum of understanding or something deeper that would, in essence, bind us together to ensure that we are pursuing goals with a common purpose, specifically in conflict prevention, where there are mechanisms in place the EU has already developed and are operational from which Canada can draw.
Vince?
I was just going to say that absolutely, I think if you can lock it in through a mechanism like the SPA, that's very important. And I think that the objectives and the principles are broad enough that it can be sustained over multiple governments. But there are other international frameworks out there that I think are locking countries in as well. And I wouldn't underestimate the value of the Sustainable Development Goals in the 2030 Agenda. So 193 countries have signed on to this. It's not legally binding, but there's a tremendous commitment globally for the implementation of the SDGs out to 2030, 15 years. So in understanding that, I mean, even 15 years is not enough in a lot of cases, but 15 years to eradicate extreme poverty and to work towards a number of goals, 17 goals all together. But this notion of, as David was saying, everything is linked and it's got to be a holistic approach. So what was really great about the Sustainable Development Goals, it moved quite a bit from the MDGs, the Millennium Development Goals. I call the SDGs the MDGs on steroids because it moved beyond the social and to a certain extent the environmental, but not even a lot of environmental, into the economic, but beyond even the economic. So you have Goal 16, very focused on peace, justice, good governance, et cetera, which Canada, the European Union, other like-mindeds fought very hard for. It was a very, very tough fight to get Goal 16 there because you can imagine some countries were not that keen on seeing Goal 16 there when there are issues of human rights and so on. And so I think there's another area where EU and Canada can continue to work together in terms of implementing Goal 16, playing up the agenda that I just talked about from a Canadian perspective on human rights, good governance, inclusivity, et cetera, but then locked in over that longer time frame.
Thank you. Maybe I can move on to another area that the agreement touches on. There is a provision in the agreement on promoting diversity of cultural expression. Now that's language that is not exactly the language we use in Canada, and the Prime Minister has spoken a lot around diversity, and the public mandate letters of the Government of Canada talk about something called peaceful pluralism. So again, there is some difference in terminology. But I'm interested to know whether the SPA provides an opportunity to promote diversity or peaceful pluralism in the way that it's framed in Canada, and whether Canada-EU cooperation really provides an opportunity to move forward in a concrete way in this area. And Colin, maybe I'll turn it over to you on that.
Well, thanks, Maurice. I guess I'd say that these framework agreements you can do whatever you like. They're like an accordion. You can take them out far, you can bring them in. And a lot of it depends on the resources that governments have at the time. I just say that I get from a bureaucrat's perspective, of course, locking in long-term makes a lot of sense, but caution against governments don't work that way. There's a change in government, then funding can change. They have different priorities. So that's something that we just have to be realistic about, so that while we may like something, that accordion may well come in. to answer your question, I'll draw from a couple of examples that I think could well fit into what Mr. Trudeau is talking about. Ultimately, and again, the Brexit debate and things very much has signaled that federations, of which Canada next year celebrates 150 years, is something that constantly evolves. Over a decade ago, we set up something called the Forum of the Federations, and it flourished for the first few years, but this past decade, it's, again, a consequence of change in government, it's really limped along and survived with the support from some of the European nations and a few others. That's something I would invest in, because I do think the whole question of federalism is once again under question. The Brexit debate brings it to a point, but no matter what happens, as you see in other parts of Europe, there's some questioning about how far things have gone, but I think that there is great value, and I think that the Canadian experiment in federalism is one that there are lessons to be shared, but I think one of the lessons I draw is that it is constantly evolving and constantly changing, that our Constitution, we do shift it, and we do have, and it is adjustable. The reintroduction, again, after almost a decade of First Ministers' conferences, I think is a quite useful piece. Something else I would bring up and address is almost directly what you're talking about in terms of diversity is the Metropolis Project, something we set up in the mid-90s, keeping in mind that 80% of Canadians live in urban centres and 75% of Europeans live in urban centres, and increasingly urban centres are where migrants go. And we've got 60 million people now floating around the world, and Europe is very much on their mind with the more recent Chancellor Merkel's wanting to place a million people around Europe. Well, there are probably lessons that we can learn. This Metropolis project we set up, which looked at the practical aspects of healthcare, of education, and to use the new term we use, sort of diversity or pluralism, as the Prime Minister puts it. I think there are things from the Canadian experience we can change, but again, I would come back to the Metropolis project, which was starved for a decade of funding, and again, limped along with support from outside of Canada, with applied research, the kind of work that David's been doing on peace operations and fragile states, but very much on how you integrate people in. And then I guess the third piece I think is really important, and I think something the SPA can really pick up is, of course, education, because I do think that one of the great achievements of the European Union has been its Erasmus project, which recently was enlarged to include some scholarships for Canadians. You know, I would take that kind of ideal and then quadruple it, increase it significantly, having Canadians study in Europe, Europeans come to Canadian universities. We certainly have capacity. And again, working with the provinces, Quebec has always led in this front. They've had a series of agreements over a long period of time, and I think the huge dividends from that are very important.
Thank you. You know, however you define pluralism or respect for cultural diversity, I think what we've seen over the past year or so in Europe with the migrant crisis really puts to the test the ability of societies to effectively integrate in a way that is, not in a planned, orderly way, but really being buffeted and subject to global events. And whatever happens in some of the spots, whether Syria, Afghanistan, parts of Africa that are precipitating that, it's likely that there are other places in the world as a result of sources of instability, including environmental sources and climate change, that's likely to continue. And I'm just wondering if anybody has a view whether the SPA can actually provide a good venue for not simply looking at pluralism in Canada and the way it's been done, but you used somebody used the word on steroids, but it may well be pluralism on steroids that we need in the future with the mass migration of populations. And are there things that Canada and the EU can do or should be doing to address what may very well be a problem that we're all facing over the coming decades?
So I think this is an absolutely crucial area where the European Union and Canada should and can collaborate, precisely because we are to a large extent, immigrant societies. Yes, there are pockets of immigration, high levels of immigration in Europe, of course, but they've also arrived there as a result of conflict. And we think of the Ukrainian population being resident in Canada, but also, to a great extent, also in Western Europe. So there are obviously linkages here that the diaspora populations can bring back to their homelands, and again, bringing more than simply remittances or channeling money back to their homelands, but also being the conduits for economic development, investment, entrepreneurial activity, including areas in which we are absolutely deficient in the areas of peace and security on the ground at the local level, where the local knowledge is absolutely essential. It's interesting, the European Union, I think, is investing heavily in these areas. There are a number of research agendas out there in Holland, for example, training diaspora communities to work in the areas of investment, become entrepreneurs, and so on. So ultimately, they will bring that local knowledge back. The knowledge that is part of being within the European Union and bringing that back to their homeland to make those countries more resilient. Ultimately, the solution isn't going to be taking in more people, but rather ensuring that the places where they come from are strong enough and have the capacity to retain their populations. So I would say that's absolutely essential for Canada and the European Union to work on. Canada, again, has a huge contribution to make here, given the demographic shifts that we've experienced over the last 20 or 30 years, in which our immigrant population is making up for the shortfall in our population growth. So yeah, that's where we should focus. Absolutely.
Thank you. Vincent.
I would just build on that, and the Prime Minister often says that Canada finds strength in its diversity, and that's really what it's all about. We are a country of immigrants, and we've been that way since our creation. I think that to a considerable extent, it's not just about how we've dealt with the current crisis, and certainly we can exchange stories and exchange lessons learned in terms of crisis management and how you get 25,000 refugees into your country in very, very short order, talk about issues of security and how you deal with that. But I think, as David's saying, it's the resilience over the longer term, and the Canadian experience in terms of absorbing immigrants into society and integrating them into their economy, in terms of how they're provided, how they're given jobs, et cetera, et cetera. And that's where I think a lot of lessons can be learned. Canada can share some of its experiences, and of course the European countries and the EU can share their experiences too. But it's that resilience piece which I think is very important.
Thank you. Did you want to say something?
I think one thing we've got to figure out better is how you communicate with people. The lasting image I have of the movement of migrants is that they've all got cell phones, and they're all very vitally aware, and they communicate by that. I think governments have got ways to catch up with how this is now an effective tool of diplomacy and of government. And certainly the opposition does this pretty well, Daesh, and I look at other less salubrious groups who use this to effect, if we are going to be communicating messages and trying to educate. I think we've done some work with the Digital Lab, for example, University of Toronto, with RAM, but I think we need to do a lot more of that in foreign ministries. And I think this is something that Europeans and Canadians could take a hard look at, because we have the technology, but how we apply it and use it, I do think is something that we have to catch up on.
Given the breadth, the SPA is dealing with a lot of areas. And we are one of 9 strategic partners for the European Union, and so presumably discussions like this are taking place with the other strategic partners, whether they use that particular instrument or otherwise. And one of the questions I have is whether in any of the areas that we're talking about, are we looking at sort of undifferentiated global cooperation, or are there natural areas in the world where there is a strategic advantage to Canada and the EU cooperating? So for example, Colin, you wrote, and Colin writes from time to time in the Globe and Mail, and you wrote a piece about Central Asia some time ago. And you talked about some of the advantages that Canada may bring in terms of its, energy technologies or, think of water management technologies, is just to take one example, is Central Asia, both from the point of view of help with some of the energy or water issues or some of the institutional underpinnings dealing with regimes that may have some challenges with governance, with rule of law, with corruption. Is that an area, for example, that would be a priority area? And what is, and I guess I'd like to ask everybody, what is your view of identifying priority areas in the world for any of these objectives that the SPA ought to be focusing on rather than just having general discussion?
Well, I think as you say, Central Asia does matter because it's become the Silk Road, Silk Belt. The Russians see it as part of their sphere of influence. The Chinese are using it for pipeline and fast rail through to Europe. The Americans, of course, have an interest. So is there a role for Canada? And is it I think it's more vitally strategic interest to Europe. But as I've argued, I think there are some things that Canada can bring to the table where we also have an interest and can bring the uranium, for example, in Kazakhstan, Australia, Kazakhstan, and Canada have basically almost 80%, 90% of the uranium in the world. I mean, perhaps we should be working together on how you manage this. If the French are going to continue, I think, likely to rely on nuclear power. Of course, it doesn't have a carbon footprint, and yes, the Germans have got out of it, but there are things we can do in that part of the world that I think also probably crosswalk to where Europe wants to be, and it's finding those points of crossover that I think are the challenges for Vince and so. But in identifying, then finding resources. And again, I still think one of the big challenges we always have is we've always got lots of great ideas, but the question is resources and then resourcing them for the longer term, the follow through. As you were talking again, we like to think in terms of 10 or 15 years, but governments don't think that way, as you pointed out, and it is hard to sustain things. And I gave two examples of the Metropolis project, great idea, the Forum of the Federations, both of which really have been on only sustained the last few years thanks to international support, but probably deserve, once again, reinvestment.
But one of the ways of dealing with the problem of limited resources is to actually choose priorities. So, I mean, one can argue whether the SPA itself, is what's in there the set of priorities for the whole relationship, or within those general titles, are there, and this will change from time to time, but in the course of the discussions that take place on at least on an annual basis, I take it, will there be an opportunity to identify specific issues that will be sort of privileged for that period of time, and I would say specific parts of the world where there is seen to be real value added in this particular partnership, working as opposed to, say, a European strategic partnership with one of its other allies that might have a different geographic focus. Sure.
Yeah, you're absolutely right. It's about complementarity. It's about sharing priorities. And I think many of these is already working today. It depends on the regions. We cooperate very closely in Africa. We do cooperate even in Eastern Europe. We were speaking about Ukraine here. But we are looking forwards to cooperate more in detail also in Latin American countries. So it's only to sit down and really after the signature of the SPA to have an overview locally, not only geographically, but also horizontally, thematically, and that's what Canada is doing and European Union is doing, where the financement comes from the European Union and maybe there is know-how from the side of Canada and vice versa. But I would like to stress that many of these cooperation and collaboration is working already today. And what is very important is working also in the international organizations. I still do remember very well, maybe coming back to the UN and SDGs topics, the negotiations in New York, where I had been now for the last 5 years, how very closely we did, European Union and Canada, cooperate on the negotiations, putting the priorities together, seeing where are our strategic alliances and going forward in that what was not so easy, negotiating the main topics and coming to the end text. And I think the UN agenda is a very good example for it, being it the drugs, being it, and we were speaking about that UN Habitat, which is coming now, and there will be definitely cooperation and collaboration identified for the future in the third countries.
Briefly, with CETA, I would like to see Canada benefit from the kinds of investments the European Union has made in clean technology. We've heard from our Prime Minister that this is, I think, an area, obviously a priority for Canada, but one where we're perhaps behind the curve and where we could benefit from the expertise of those countries and those businesses and industries who have really shown leadership in the area. Again, this was something Angela Merkel made very clear was a priority for her at the G7 meeting last year. But let me go out on a limb here because I met the representative from Malta, which will assume the presidency in 2017. Climate change, fragile states, and technological innovation, where do they converge? Well, they converge in that little island called Malta because we have a problem with the small island states that are inexorably caught up in climate change. Ones that we don't hear about, not the big ones like Syria that has experienced refugee flows as a result of climate change, which Stéphane Dion spoke of at great length as being a problem for the world, but ones that are literally not on the radar screen. And because they're so small and inconsequential to larger security issues and economic development, that their voice tends not to be heard. But there's Malta, with its expertise in small island developing states capacity building, focusing on questions of resilience and how these small islands are essentially going to be bear the brunt of climate change if they haven't already. Now, as it turns out, Canada has worked heavily in this area through the IDRC, our National Development Research Center, and through the Commonwealth, because many of our trade partners from the Caribbean and elsewhere are members of the Commonwealth, and Malta has a natural link to the Commonwealth as well. So there's an overlapping set of institutions in play here, and in addition, there's an existing agenda to work on the linkage between climate change and how they affect or threaten these small island states. There's a lot of lessons to be learned here, and then of course there's the technological side with engineering capacities being brought to bear to basically build barriers to prevent these countries from being overwhelmed by climate change. Then there's the elephant in the room, Greenland, which naturally, as the ice shelf slips away slowly, perhaps more quickly than we believe, that changes the way in which we will relate to the European Union in the Arctic. So I would put that on the table as well as perhaps not a priority, but one that we need to be sensitive to with its relationship to Denmark and so on, as being something that matters in the way we negotiate Arctic sovereignty.
Vince?
I was going to say, you're right. When you look at the SPA, it's quite expansive, covers a lot of ground, and it is always about priorities at the end of the day. I think if you're looking at opportunities for Canada and the EU to work together in other regions of the world and apply the SPA to countries or to situations, I think, again, that issue of fragility will jump out. This government's made it very clear. It's in the mandate letter of Minister Bibeau. On the development side, I believe it's in the mandate letter for Minister Dion as well, that fragile states are where we're going to be focusing quite a bit of our efforts. And then if you're going to do that and take on that issue of fragility, you can take some of those areas within the SPA, and you can't just cherry pick, but again, going back to this holistic approach, taking security dimensions, taking development dimensions, taking human rights, pluralism, diversity, and even humanitarian assistance, playing into longer-term development and resilience and so on, and putting together packages, for lack of a better term, and seeing how they can be applied. And Africa clearly jumps to mind as a continent that I do believe the current government is going to want to re-engage in to a certain extent. Mr. Dion again has been saying that Canada's back in Africa too. So this may be an opportunity to look at some areas where the EU and Canada could work together in addressing that issue of fragility.
Morris, I would just say, in whatever we come up with, and then things you want to build a sustainable coalition of support behind it as well, because if it's simply just a kind of a bureaucratic tableau, it will not last changes of government. But if it has interest group support behind it, and the preference would be that an interest groups on both the European side and Canadian side that back these things, then when you get changes in temperament or in government, then they are more likely to endure. As we know, programs that have strong domestic bases in both places are more, because again, in a democratic system, that's how things work. So whatever we come up with, I think building strong domestic constituencies or finding where they are, that will more likely result in their being able to sustain over a longer period of time and therefore achieve the kind of results that Vince has talked about.
I would agree with you, and I think there's probably work to be done in Canada to revitalize a little bit Canadian NGOs, civil society, to put them in a position, because I really do think that they are, in a sense, the infrastructure of democracy. And if you don't have legitimacy outside of the government for supportive issues, it may be more difficult. It will be more difficult for governments to sustain that. So I'm very much with you. Vince.
Just jump on that, because I think it's a very important point, but it's not just about how we work with CSOs, but it's how we work with a plethora of partners. So whether it's the private sector, whether it's foundations, whether it's provinces, territories, I think just speaking from a Canadian perspective, we have so many strengths in that regard. So it's not just a whole of government approach, but it's a whole of Canada, whole of country. And as we're about to launch into the international assistance review, I mean, one of the thematic areas that the minister really wants to focus on is partnerships, how we can do partnerships better. CSOs are critical, absolutely essential, but there are so many others as well that we can work with.
Just to build on that, one area where the EU and Canada have seen great success is the Balkans. And I would say that let's not reinvent the wheel. Let's revisit what we've done and what works and what is successful. All the tools are at our disposal, and we saw them being applied effectively and properly in concert with the Organization for Security and Cooperation in Europe and with NATO in the Balkans. And the results are clear. I mean, that investment in prevention that was made in Macedonia and elsewhere has paid dividends for those countries. And they don't forget that as trading partners, as future partners that will be part of the European Union if they're not already. And I think we need to look at Africa in the same way. Today's countries that we may see as being sort of those which we are investing in heavily, our development assistance, will eventually be our trading partners. I mean, there's a fundamental demographic shift that both of our places are experiencing right now. Low growth and low inflation are partly a function of our aging populations. And we need to think more broadly about where the growth is going to come from that will drive our economy as well as the trade that is the engine behind that growth. So, and that would be, to a large extent, Sub-Saharan Africa, the Middle East, and Central Asia, of course, with booming populations.
I just wanted to open a small parenthesis on something that Vince said and talked about holistic approaches, which has been kind of the holy grail of the Canadian government for a long time when we talked about horizontality. And not to put you on the spot, but one of the things that you're living with now is you're the policy ADM in an integrated foreign policy, foreign affairs, trade, and development department, something that didn't exist a few years ago, and I think there was a lot of concern when this was done about the place of development in this. And I wonder if you could just comment, how's it working, and is it actually providing? I know that there are other players outside of the Global Affairs Department, but as a key player in all of this, is this coming together?
Morris was our first deputy under amalgamation, so I'm going to be very careful what I say here. Your legacy lives on.
I have no power, so.
It's funny because we appeared before the ministers, Minister Bibeau and Minister Dion, then officials right after appeared before the House of Commons Foreign Affairs Committee just last week, and this was one of the questions that Daniel Jean, our Undersecretary of State, received. How is amalgamation going? So I've got good lines I can fall back on. But no, I think it's gone actually very well. Having been at CETA before I came over to what was then DFAT-D and now Global Affairs, my greatest concern is that there was going to be a culture clash, and that a development versus a security versus a prosperity, trade, and investment mindset, it just wasn't going to come together. I think it has. I think it's come together partly through great leadership, including your own, Morris. At the outset, we put in place, I think, a really good governance structure. Right at the top in terms of the deputy ministers meeting on a regular basis. We call it DM3, DM4 now with the associate deputy. We have a strong policy committee. We have a strong program committee, corporate committees that really bring together all the different streams of the department to make sure that everything that goes up is integrated and it's coherent. As the chair of the policy committee, I can speak to that in particular. No major initiative goes up to ministers without going through the policy committee. And that's where we really ask the question, why don't you have more development in this? Why don't you have more trade in this? Are you piecing this all together? And I think also it starts at the very, very top with the ministers. And I can say that the ministers that we have right now work incredibly well together. And it's particularly impressive when you consider how much they travel. They're constantly on the road, but they also talk a lot. And I think we're making tremendous progress, whether it's on trade and development, where I think some stuff is really starting to gain traction. It goes back to your point, David, about how the development challenges of today are going to be economic opportunities down the road. I think we're doing some good work on development and security nexus as well. That's coming together. So yeah, I think it's really, it's and I'm not just saying this because I feel I've got to say this. I've lived it for the last 3 years. I think we've made tremendous progress.
I wonder if I could put Edita on the spot on this. The same question, in a sense, everything truly is connected to everything else, and it does take an effort at a coordinated, holistic approach. How does it work within Europe? How do you pull people together? And you're not only dealing with, governance in Brussels, but often bring the states in.
Yeah. I think after so many years trying to build European Union up, having new member states, you see that the coordination of the policies is one of the strengths of the European Union. Of course, there are policies which are the competence only of European Union. There are others, we were talking about it, which are in the competence of the member states. But the system, I think, is very well developed. The meetings of the ministers, respective ministers, coming together once in a month and speaking about the more important topics for them, putting together the agenda and agreeing the ways forward is very well. It works very well, and a lot is discussed, and not only on the level of ministers, but also on the working level and the international organizations also. So that's why European Union is able to speak in one voice. That's what we want also in the international organizations, and it's a matter of coordinations. Maybe sometimes it takes more time than it would be appreciated by all the countries which are out of the European Union. But then if we agree, then we really agree, and we stuck on these agreements, and it's one voice. So that's, I think, important. It's important for our partners, for Canada, and for each and everyone in the world that's working like this. I don't say it's easy, but it works apparently.
Thanks. Before I open it up for questions, I have one more question that I wanted to ask, and that is about Title II of the Strategic Partnership Agreement is entitled Upholding and Advancing democratic principles, human rights, and fundamental freedoms. So we've just had recently the 2016 Freedom House report, not a happy read, says that for the 10th consecutive year, we have seen a decline in global freedom. It makes all the more important, I think, the fact that there is a specific objective in the SPA on advancing democratic principles. And anybody be interested in your views as to what the two parties ought to privilege in this regard, both with respect to any specific areas in the world that they should collaborate in, and any kind of specific instruments that they ought to be using on this. David?
Well, I think the challenge here is it's partly, I'm going to put an analytical problem to you, which is that the countries that are experiencing the greatest decline in freedoms, political freedoms, and civil rights and political liberties, which is the way Freedom House typically measures it, are not necessarily the ones that are most amenable to external influence. In other words, we're seeing increases in or reductions in freedoms and civil rights and human rights in countries that are technically economically prosperous or middle-income countries in some cases, but not necessarily at the lowest rung of the poverty development spectrum, which means then that the kinds of influence, the way in which outside players, if you will, like the European Union and Canada need to think about, are the kinds of engagement that are beyond the scope of conventional development assistance, which is typically tied in some ways to performance in other areas. And these are the real challenges of the so-called middle-income, failed and fragile states that I would put to the policy community as the puzzle of this latter half of this century. Countries that are experiencing economic development but not commensurate increase in political freedoms. We're seeing a shutting down of those political freedoms while at the same time seeing economic prosperity improve overall. The real challenge by the middle of this century will be that the bulk of the most impoverished people will be located in these countries. So then you've got a real challenge here in that your level of influence over these countries is diminished, assuming that they are still politically intractable, while at the same time they're host to very unstable populations. The dialogue that we might have with a Mali or a Burundi is going to be significantly different with a Yemen or a Pakistan or whatever country where these kinds of influences are being experienced with the diminishing political freedoms available to the people there. Are we prepared for more Arab Springs, in other words? That seems to be likely if that's the trajectory these countries are headed.
Thanks. Yes.
Yeah, I think, and that's absolutely right. Human rights, rule of law, that are the basic principles where we are very much like-minded countries. The collaboration and cooperation among us is really very bright, and that both of us, we are the entity, the European Union and Canada, we are the partners which really want to get the things done. And that is where the cooperation among us is working already, and I think that's a very important issue, and that's where we can develop much more and for the future also.
Morris, to answer your question directly in terms of promotion of democratic institutions and good governance, rather than recreate the wheel, sometimes we've done that, but the experience wasn't all that happy with our Broadbent Institute, but there's a number of other institutions, the Parliamentary Centre here in Canada, there's the Democratic Nationalists, the DNI, which many Canadians are involved in, doing superb work in terms of governance in Tunisia. There are Dutch, Norwegian, Swedish organizations I'm familiar with. I would look to the existing organizations that are already there, that are well placed, and I think that's probably where the strategic partnership should do, rather than trying to create something all new, because there's some very effective organizations out there that could do with some more support, and I think that is more likely to building on their current track record to achieve what you're trying to achieve, which is exactly results.
Thank you. Okay, I think it's probably time for us to open it up to the audience. I think there are 2 microphones on either side, so if you have a question, just put your hand up and Identify yourself.
Thank you very much. I purposely decided to sit back and listen because I really wanted to hear how you thought the opportunities going forward would be, and I certainly wasn't disappointed. With regards to the point on the provinces and territories, they were not part of the delegation, but they were very much consulted. Why? Because, of course, the SPA does touch on their areas of jurisdiction, whether it's education, mobility, culture, and they contributed a lot of good ideas, and so that will continue. On an annual basis, we have a joint committee that meets together, and they'll have an opportunity to continue to be engaged as we move forward. I thought it was a very interesting point with regards to the fact that the amalgamated department, Vince, I think this is why Canada is even a more strategic partner for the European Union. From my vantage point in Poland, as we were dealing with Ukraine, I often heard the Americans being very jealous of the fact that we were able to move on all fronts on Ukraine, whether it was trade or development or on the political. So I think this will be very helpful. And I guess finally, just an observation, it isn't. You asked about whether, in fact, the SPA sets the agenda. No. It is a buffet table, and the governments will draw from it as they see necessary with regards to the priorities that come up. But more importantly, it isn't even so much where, it's the how. And I think being innovative, being creative, and I was really happy, Dr. Carment, that you referred to resilience. This is an area we're facing protracted conflicts in the world, things that we've never faced, perhaps at least not in the recent future, that we need to be able to find new ways to be able to address, and we're doing that. I think some questions are coming now. So.
Good afternoon. I'm Ursula Goebel, Associate V with the Social Science Minds Research Council, SSHRC. Thank you very much for this discussion. Do you feel that there's more that can be done in the context of the partnerships and the multi-sector collaboration that was discussed here to really facilitate international research collaboration and funding mechanisms that will truly advance now the research that's needed?
I'll take a shot at this as someone who's on the receiving end of your grants and has
right, thanks.
Exactly. You've prioritized diaspora as a key area where Canada should be thinking, and I think that was brought up in the discussion. But absolutely, more and more European academics are being motivated by the same kinds of agendas and incentives that I think we see in North America. So absolutely, there's a need for high-level strategic collaboration. I put the diaspora agenda on the table. In fact, we're currently approaching Warwick University in Kiel in the UK, precisely because they see the need to reach out to Canadian universities and researchers. But more importantly, they're funded by the European funding agencies, which are highly coveted and very difficult to get. So when they get some of those kinds of research grants, they are well respected within their research community. As a result, then they have significant clout within their academic community. And I think then that could be leveraged by us, by the Canadian academic community, to access that kind of research. The Europeans, I have to say, having tried to access some of their funds and work within the European academic research granting system, it's highly competitive and very, very significant to their career advancement. So I would say, yes, it should be a priority for us.
Just probably not directly relevant to your question, but David put a plug in before for the International Development Research Center, and I would just put another plug in that it's about the research that we do together, Canada, EU, and other countries, but building up the capacity of fragile states, developing countries to conduct their own research. And IDRC it's got a tremendous international reputation. I think sometimes it doesn't get the respect it deserves domestically, and we're looking forward in global affairs to really building on the relationship and making it a key partner as we move forward. They've got tremendous expertise and capacity in a lot of the areas that we've talked about today, and I think we can leverage them a lot more and work together a lot more closely.
Thank you. I represent that other small island state in the Mediterranean that is a member of the European Union and of the Commonwealth. I'm the High Commissioner of Cyprus. So thank you very much for this very thoughtful discussion. What struck me, having attended this and the seminar and the strategic dialogue between the European Union and Canada a couple of weeks ago, is the common theme and focus on resilience as a kind of shield to protect against fragile states and how to build the societies. And I was glad to hear today, as I heard last time around, a kind of explanation of how you build resilient states. So it's not sufficient to say resilient states. Last time around, Assistant Deputy Minister Gadowski was the name, focused on values, part of the SPAs. Today, I heard the very wise observation that promotion of democracy in the form of electoral democracy is premature if you do not have a democratic society already there, and you better focus on building the rule of law, administration of justice, and so on. So I was very pleased to hear that. But I would ask you to reflect, how well did we, the European Union, or Canada, but especially the European Union, do in promoting that? Take the Middle East, for example. Was the focus on building the rule of law, civil society, or was it on bringing about electoral democracy? One man, one vote, meaning often you vote once. Thank you.
Well, I just think the one thing we've learned is that you're far better to build the institutions of free press, a rule of law, a sound judiciary, good government. Simply voting is not equal. It may be democracy, but that's not how you build long-term sustainable democratic institutions. I think we've learned that lesson over the last 20 years. So they put the emphasis on the institutions and developing bluntly the attitudes and habits of democracy, and then they sometimes take generations to develop.
I would define resilience as a third-place political party coming back and winning it all in an election. That's an amazing ability you don't see very often. Or a hockey team that is down 3-1 and comes back and wins in 7 games. But more specifically, for our state to become resilient, it needs to be immunized. Much like our children who are immunized, we have a whole healthcare system that treats the potential for debilitating diseases, and not necessarily those that will actually affect the child in particular. We need to think, as has been said repeatedly, holistically. A whole-of-government approach was something the Canadian government introduced over 10 years ago through their national policy statement. We have the tools, we have the investments. But in our case, it's thinking about how good governance is shaped partly by good decisions and leadership. And we haven't talked about it yet at all, but I think an institute that is focused on training good leaders is something where both the European Union and Canada could consider investing. Ultimately, countries face various forks in the road, if you will, and the decisions that are made at any particular point will determine the fate of that country. We observed Chile and Haiti both experience calamitous earthquakes. Chile recovers within a week. Haiti is devastated and incapable of recovery without massive amounts of external assistance. Obviously, there's a lot more to that picture than simply the impact of the earthquake. But I think one can trace resilience back to the decisions that leaders made at a previous point in time that shaped that country's future. And we can talk about institutions in vague, abstract terms, but it really comes down to high-quality leadership and the ability for leaders to make the right choices with the public interest in mind. Having worked in Crimea before the crisis there with funding from the IDRC, I can tell you that the idea of the public interest was something that was anathema to the people there. The idea that you could take information and build evidence-based policy out of it was something that is foreign to many countries. And we have copious experience here. Our parliamentarians live or die on the basis of having fact-based information at their disposal that they can bring to the debate in Parliament. We need to think more specifically about how we can train those individuals responsible for the welfare of their populations to make responsible decisions. And I think that partly comes from good leadership, but it's not born, it's created, if you will.
I was just going to on this issue, or the question was around resilience to help fragile states. And I'm not sure that democracy promotion is the first thing that I would go to. And I'd go back to the 2011 World Bank World Development Report that dealt with fragile and conflict-affected states. And they, I thought quite wisely, had a kind of a hierarchy of needs of interventions. You didn't start with things like economic development or even with things like assuring healthcare. You started with building basic safety and security, because if we didn't have that, people would be afraid to even go, to find a doctor or to get water or whatever. So, in terms of the building blocks of this stuff, there are some basic building blocks that need to be put in place first. And I agree, all of these things are necessary at some point. I mean, the art of this is, one, the strategic patience it takes in a place like Haiti to do this over a significant period of time. And yes, leadership in all societies is important. The nature of leadership is changing. I was in Haiti after the earthquake, and I spoke to the Prime Minister of Haiti, who was a very, European-educated guy, very erudite, as a lot of the elites in these countries are. But he said, the analogy he gave, he said, it's like, being at the steering wheel of a car that's not, there was no drive shaft connected to anything else. Beyond the elite level of leadership, they didn't have the capacity, the training of a competent public sector, of competent people, of honest people who were actually able to deliver the kind of services that were necessary. So yes, by all means, leadership is necessary, but I think in the case of some of the most fragile states in the world, I think you need to find a way of having a concerted effort over a very long period of time to build leadership, to educate the population, but to put in place and keep in place those basic elements of safety and security, to give people a sense of fairness and justice so that it becomes a place where they actually are willing to invest and build rather than just be out for themselves.
I would like to add on to this. My name is Eva Cohen. I'm the liaison officer for the Federal German Agency of Technical Relief. And I think all the things we've just heard about resilience and the cooperation between Canada and the European Union could also be broadened up in the sense of disaster relief or proactive climate change preparedness and response. And in fact, we're already working on a close cooperation between Germany, the EU, and Canada in this area. And I think the current situation in Alberta just highlights that there is still a lot of work ahead of us, but that we're also looking into the right direction with the idea of engaging ordinary citizens as trained volunteers into the overall preparedness and response efforts. And I would really love to see this area of very important work and international combined work as part of this conversation. Thank you.
That's an excellent point. I was actually going to raise it in the context of resilience as well, how we're defining it, kind of building on what Morris was saying, that it's beyond a political definition, but takes on so much more social, economic, especially in the context of humanitarian disasters. And our current Minister of International Development is really focused on humanitarian assistance. We're a top humanitarian assistance donor, I think 6th largest in the world, and wants to see how we can be a more effective donor over time, but most importantly, how we link up short-term humanitarian assistance with longer-term development programming to actually build that resilience. And it's a timely conversation because, of course, we've got the World Humanitarian Summit just around the corner, where a lot of these discussions will be taking place, and hopefully we'll see some progress. But I agree, this is an area where we could really build on some good work with the EU.
Thanks. Was there a question down? Oh, sorry. Thank you.
Denise Amiot, I'm CEO of Colleges and Institutes Canada. Il y en a un d'entre vous qui a parlé d'éducation. It was you, Colin. You mentioned the importance of education, and I was very pleased to hear that in light of the discussion. Where it's weak, though, is with respect to the number of students, of Canadians that in fact go in Europe to study. In total, at the college level, it's only 3%. At university level, it's 5%. There used to be a great program 10 years ago that was cut with respect to mobility of students. So I'd like to hear the panel about what do you think we could do, in fact, to encourage more students to study overseas?
Well, you know, I don't know, but just,
Money.
well, people are, yeah, money is one thing, but I don't know to what extent, and maybe Vince knows to what extent work is being done on looking at the international education strategy, because the reality is we spend a lot of effort encouraging foreign students to come and study in Canada. But if you compare Canada's performance in this regard to other like-minded countries, the number of Canadian students that are studying abroad is much, much less. So I don't have the answer to this. Some of this may be a question of money. Some of this may be a question of whether education outside the country is actually valued and marketable when people come back to the country, and that may go to a question of business culture in the country. But I would say that I totally agree with you, Denise, on the nature of the problem, that in a globalized world where we are looking beyond, and this goes to the CETA, beyond the relationship with the United States, to diversify, and this has been a long-standing, sort of holy grail of Canadian international commercial policy, to diversify our relationships. Having people who actually have studied and lived abroad and who understand other cultures, I think is absolutely necessary in terms of being able to effectively engage in the world, whether it's for trade or commercial reasons or for other reasons.
I was at something at Simon Fraser a couple of years ago, and involving the Western provinces, and one of the things that struck me was the transfer of getting credit for taking courses at the other universities, it's just within Canada, was abysmal. That if you took a course at UBC, it didn't necessarily count at Simon Fraser. So, in addition to the money issue, making sure that when you go abroad for 6 months, the credits can still be applied, because I think that weighs into how students. So I think there are some technical barriers which would seem to me pretty easy to overcome, and that an organization like what you're involved with might be able to play some role in that, to ensure that in addition to the money issues you've talked about, that you will get credit for the period of time that you're abroad, that you can apply this back in to your degree.
Sorry,
No, go ahead.
Interrupt, but if I'm not mistaken, actually might be mentioned in Minister Dion's letter, or certainly to work with the Minister of Heritage, if I'm not mistaken, to look at this as an issue. I think it is a priority for the government moving ahead, international education, talking about the issues that we've just bandied back and forth here. But it also speaks to a broader issue that I was going to lay out earlier, and it's the question of youth writ large, which I think has its own section in the SPA. And of course, you've got a Prime Minister who's also the Minister of Youth. And I can tell you that he's very, very focused on these issues. I'm his Sherpa on the G20, and I've got very explicit instructions on youth engagement, bringing out youth employment, young girls, young women, and so on. So you were asking before more areas that we may want to look at. Education, but as a subset of youth writ large, I think it's really big for this government. I know it's big for this government.
I think in considering your question, that we are victims of our own success. A School of International Affairs that is able to place its students within various departments within the Canadian government is creating an incentive structure in which the students don't necessarily see the value of going abroad. I'm not saying that's universally true, but for those who would naturally be looking outward, programs like the one where I teach, or the one at Ottawa U, or Monk, Vasili, and so on, they will typically see more value in finding job placement that they can benefit from in a long-term career. On the other hand, there's something very simple that this government can do, and that's reinstate the Canadian Studies Abroad program. That's something that was cut, was penny wise, pound foolish. Several academics, as you know, wrote at great length decrying that decision. As editor of Canadian Foreign Policy Journal, I also have an international advisory board. Many academics abroad, the UK, Australia, China, and so on, who would love to see more Canadians integrated into their programs. They are studying Canada, but they're not teaching Canadian students who can then go abroad to be part of their program. So small amounts of money can be invested and deliver huge dividends. And by the way, it also promotes Canada beyond maple syrup and the other traditional kinds of things that we want to do. Canadian students are your best ambassadors. Quite frankly, they will speak positively of Canada abroad if given the right opportunities. And I think the European Union has seen that by virtue of their kinds of efforts that they're trying to bring to Canadians and encourage them to go abroad.
Well, thank you very much for a very interesting discussion. And I have a rather naive question as ambassador of Japan, belonging to Asia Pacific. I understand this EU-Canada Strategic Partnership Agreement ultimate objective is to ensure the stability, security, and prosperity of the world. So you deal not only with the bilateral issues or transatlantic issues, but deal with other areas or matters. So my question is, what is the place of Asia Pacific? Well, Europe is so far from Asia, but when we have Japan-EU talks, we always talk about Asia. And between Japan and Canada, we do that. But Canada is Atlantic country, but also a Pacific country. So my question is, this Canada's interest as a Asia-Pacific nation, how that it be represented in this bilateral talk? You talk only about transatlantic issues because Balkan and Ukraine and Africa and Middle East and Afghan, those are more for the transatlantic issues. But you are both members of G7, so I hope the Asia matter will be dealt with also.
Who wants to answer that? I can give you a really parochial answer again in the G20 context, and also I think in the G7 as well. Under the Japanese presidency, G7 is very focused on Asia-Pacific issues, a lot of other issues as well. Under the Chinese presidency, the G20s looking at Asia-Pacific issues to some extent, perhaps less so, but at least through a Chinese lens, looking at a lot of national issues as well. And very much a domestic lens they look through at G20 items. So around the G20 table, my next door neighbor is the EU representative, so we work very, very closely together in that context. And I know the G7 Sherpa, Peter Beam, works very closely with his EU counterpart in a G7 context to work some of these issues. So I can tell you in the context of those two forums, especially this year where you've got this convergence of a Japanese and a Chinese presidency respectively, there's a lot of thought going into that.
Exactly. The SPA is about the strategic partnership between European Union and Canada, but it's also about how we will approach the third countries. And that's definitely, we were speaking about more the crisis region or the places where something actually now is happening, which is of the strategic interest of both of us. But this definitely not means that we are forgetting about Asia and Asian partners. And I have the security and I know that because we are meeting on the level of working groups, and one of these working groups is also consultants about our relations towards Asia, that we will also tackle such simple problems or maybe zones of interest where we can approach together towards the third countries over there.
Okay, I think we're out of time. So would you join me in thanking the panel for a very interesting discussion?